Hi everyone, happy Wednesday. This is Jane Lovsky, and I'm your partner for bookkeeping and controller services. And as always, Irene Sky is here with us today, and she is our partner for employment law. And today we're going to discuss employment rules for restaurants. And we have quite a few things to talk about. So I would like to get started and have a discussion on this. And I would like to ask a question to Irene to get us started. So, what are the minimum wages for restaurant employees and what are the tip credits and how do they go hand in hand?
Hi everyone, happy Wednesday. So restaurant employees and restaurants in general are definitely very specific, and hospitality has certain rules that I think we'll cover today briefly uh, that are unique to the hospitality industry and unique to restaurant ownership altogether. So of course, there's a differentiation, which is the case in a lot of times between New York City and New York State. And that's no exception with hospitality and restaurants. And so the minimum wage for New York City, for Long Island, for Westchester would be $15 an hour. And that's presently, of course, we've seen a lot of changes. So that's definitely subject to change. So that's something to look out for. But in the rest of New York State, that number actually is $13.20. And then there's also what's known as a tip credit, which I think we'll get into a little bit more detail afterwards. And then that tip credit is allows for a certain credit off that minimum wage. So a portion to be paid as minimum wage and a portion to be able to be compensated by the tips. And what that means is that as long as an employee is making at least, let's say in New York City, where the minimum wage is $15 an hour, at least $5 an hour in tips, they can actually receive $10 an hour as their minimum wage from the employer, but they must be making $5 an hour on tips. And so, of course, as we've talked about almost with every topic and almost every single week, having the right information and documentation to show this is very, very important. And this, of course, would extend to any wait staff or bartenders, busing personnel, food runners, hosts, etc. And it's very important to ensure that the policies for tipping would include everybody who would be subject to this tip credit if one were to be put forward. And so the rest of New York State would allow, because that wage we talked about is a little lower, $13.20, they actually allow $8.80 in cash wage and $4.40 to be in tips. And it's for the same staff of wait staff, bartenders, busing personnel, food runners, hosts, etc. And so it does also permit that delivery personnel and other tipped positions that do not include service workers also receive a tip credit, but have to be very specific here because their numbers are different. So their numbers are $11 that are paid in from the employer and $2.20 that can be paid in tips. So once again, all this has to be documented. It's a lot of work to make sure that you're documenting those tips coming in. I know it's a lot of work. A lot of the times we have questions when the tips come in cash. Documentation would be the most important part here.
Okay, thank you. And then I know you've mentioned the term tip a lot. Would you be able to define that specifically relating to restaurants?
Of course. So the way that the tip is gratuity, as we sometimes see it if we were to go out to dinner. What that is defined as is that is money that's given by a customer or somebody that visits the establishment to the employee for the service that's provided to the customer. It is not provided as a service charged by the restaurant. It is not in any way to be kept by the restaurant and then later a portion of that to be given to the employee. It is for the total amount of that tip to be given over to the employee. And a charge made to the customer in addition to charges for food, drinks, lodging, or other materials or services that could have been provided is presumed to be a tip, but it is very important that that is documented the right way, that that is a tip. So sometimes you'll see, and I've heard even in personal settings, well, what is a service charge? Who really keeps that? Does the restaurant keep that? So it is very important that it's specifically told to the employee who is going to keep those tips or service charges, especially when you're using ambiguous terms like service charge, and sometimes people are worried, does that actually get to the employee or not?
Right. I think that's actually a really important point. So thanks for explaining all that. And I think another really important that we have to talk about are the breaks. I know there's specific regulations about like what, when, how. Can you please talk to us about that?
Absolutely. And so for breaks, it is very important. We find that the break time, even when it is provided and given, if a break time is not accounted for correctly, the employer oftentimes loses the ability to be able to claim that break as hours worked. And what can happen is if an employee actually receives their break, that could be a lunch break plus an additional personal break as well, even if they receive that break, but they do not, the employer does not account for it, that time could be actually added as if it was their hours worked, which could push an employee over to overtime as well. And so the general rule is that for any shift of 6 or more hours, beginning after 6 a.m., but before 1 p.m., that a 30-minute unpaid break has to be taken between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. For shifts of 6 or more hours starting after 1 p.m. and before 6 a.m., 45-minute unpaid break has to be taken at the midpoint. And then for shifts starting before 11 a.m. and ending after 7 p.m., a 30-minute unpaid break has to be taken between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. And a second one, at least 25 minutes, has to be taken between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. Now, these are the breaks. This is different because these are the breaks that are, if you notice, I mentioned that they're unpaid. There are also the paid lunch breaks, and there are also paid breaks that an employee can take. Typically, if a break time that is not mandatory, and that's what's separate in this industry, these are mandatory breaks. But there are also breaks that are not mandatory that you could provide an employee with an additional 30-minute break, as long as it's over 20 minutes, which is a general rule, but it does depend on jurisdiction where you are. So that's something to look out for. Those typically you can account for and deduct from the hours. In order to do that, it is very, very important to keep a good record and to really make sure that you can really account for every hour. So if somebody were to take that lunch between 1 and 2, the best practice is always clock in, clock out, just so that you really could keep track of those hours and that somebody really did receive both the mandatory breaks that are required in restaurant industry, as well as those paid breaks, so that you can really get a credit for those hours. So
Thank you.
one of the things I would like to just shift over and ask you about, Jane, we have a question all the time, and that revolves around the term spread of hours. And so we find that to be a question in a lot of our employment clients, especially those in the restaurant industry. And there's a lot of confusion whether they have to pay that or not. So how would you define spread of hours and determine who is required to pay spread of hours?
Thanks, Irene. That's a great question. I feel like the spread of hours is very specific to the hospitality industry, and we deal with that, primarily when we deal with restaurant clients. So basically, the New York State spread of hours law states that an employer is required to pay an extra hour of minimum wage compensation if the employee worked more than 10 hours long. And the shift is basically calculated from the clock in to clock out, and there's no subtraction for the breaks, and the employee must be paid that one additional hour at the full-time minimum wage, and there's no offset to any credits for meals. And it applies to everyone evenly, so regardless of the pay rate, they have to get that spread of hours received.
That's very interesting. And so we've talked about also one of the questions that comes up, and there's again a lot of confusion that revolves around break times. And there's so many specific things that are specific to restaurant industry, and another one of those points really has to do with breaks and then meal credits. So I know that restaurants, especially coming off of COVID, are struggling, and so they try to find as many credits as they can anywhere that they can, and sometimes that's in breaks, but also there's a meal credit. And I understand that not everyone could qualify for that. So how would a company or how would a restaurant qualify for a meal credit?
Yeah, that's actually a good point because there's also, it's very specifically defined, right? So we could quickly go through that. So meal credits are allowed, and basically it could be reduced from the cash wage paid to the employees. But in order for it to be considered a meal, it has to have fruits or vegetables, grains or potatoes, eggs, meat, fish, poultry, tea, coffee, milk, or juice. So it's very specific on what you have to provide. And then also, it's not allowed to be given to employees who have a work shift less of 5 hours, and you cannot claim more than 2 meals per single day. And so we could quickly look at the how much you could deduct. So let's say if you're in New York City and it's a food service employee, you could deduct per meal $3.60. And if you're talking about the rest of the New York State, that's $3.15 for the per meal. So it's very, very specific, and you have to qualify based on those criterias.
But that's very, very good to know for a lot of the restaurants that might be actually doing this already and just might need to now qualify this and really document it. So that's definitely really good to know for a lot of the restaurants. And I do have another question. So we have, and a lot of the times the questions that I'm bringing up oftentimes come when we're already looking for certain defenses and an employee has come forward with a claim and now we're trying to see, well, where do we have some defenses? And all of these points that Jane has brought up really is what we look out for in the restaurant industry. So getting ahead of it always is very beneficial than having to backtrack and try to find them. And so one of those points is uniforms. And the question is, what are the limitations or possibly even benefits for employers who require uniforms to be worn from their employees?
Yes, it's also another great benefit, but it's also really, really important for employers to make sure that they're in compliance. So actually, one of our previous podcasts, we talked about taxable fringe benefits, and I mentioned something about clothing, which could go hand in hand with uniforms a little bit. So if a clothing is given to an employee that is suitable for streetwear, meaning that it's not look specifically in like a uniform, then this could be a taxable benefit. However, uniforms are not a taxable benefit. So if the employer is requesting that the employee is required to purchase uniforms, then the next day the employer has to reimburse the employee. If the employer is furnishing anything or giving an employee a uniform, it should not be in any way included or excluded from the employee's paycheck, right? So it has to be strictly provided by the employer. Also, if the maintenance of the uniform, right, it has to be either the employee must be given just enough uniforms that they could switch and they don't have to incur any additional costs. But otherwise, it should all be on the employer to make sure that the employee is compensated. They should not in any way suffer that they have to purchase or maintain the uniform. It should not be taken out of their paycheck, right? And then there's also, if the employee is required to maintain a uniform, there's also like some sort of pay that they should receive. So for example, if somebody is working over 30 hours per week and the rate in New York City is that they could get 18.65 dollars for the maintenance of this uniforms. It varies exactly where you are. And then there's basically the high, medium, and low. And it all kind of goes back to how many hours the employee is working. So if it's over 30 hours per week, it's a high rate. If it's between 20 to 30 hours, you're in the medium, and then 20 hours or fewer, that would be the low rate. But I think what we should take away is that the employers have to make sure that the employee is compensated, and making sure that nothing is being taken out of their paycheck for maintaining or paying for uniforms.
This is all really great news because a lot of the times, as I said, we're looking for those defenses. And if you don't do every single point or you don't have everything documented, we might possibly lose that defense. So getting ahead of it is so, so important. And all this information is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you mentioned, maintaining proper records, this is really key to everything. So I would like to, make sure that that the employers make sure they have all the records on file. So as always, thanks everyone. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Bye.